Thanks very much to all three of the panelists. I wonder whether, do any of you want to comment on anything that the others have said in the course of all this before we turn to audience discussion? Elaine?
Thank you very much. So, as you can imagine, I don't agree with all the comments of my fellow panelists, and there are a few in particular I'll just say a brief word on. First of all, on the Bombardier case, my understanding is that Boeing doesn't make the plane that Bombardier is selling to Delta. They didn't bid on the Delta contract because they don't make that plane. So as a Canadian, and again, I'm going on what I read in the newspapers, it's very hard to understand how there is a preliminary determination with a 220% duty rate for a plane that isn't made in the United States. But I'll leave that. So getting back to the issue of panelists, I think there are some very valid points that have been made, and certainly the issue of remuneration is key. I'm told that when I was Assistant Deputy Minister for North America, I authorized an increase in the actual remuneration, but I don't actually remember doing that. So it certainly wasn't a lot of money. And certainly the fees that we paid to our counsel in Washington were much, much higher than the fees we were paying to the NAFTA Secretariat. But I think it's also important to recognize that there is a distinction between the Court of International Trade and NAFTA panels, in that, my understanding is the CIT is usually one judge. NAFTA panels are 5 people, and while they may not all be math PhDs, there is a chance for greater concentration on the issues at hand when you've got 5 people looking at the entire record and the material that's been turned over than you do with one judge in the Court of International Trade who maybe doesn't necessarily deal with these issues related to CVD and AD all the time. So I think it's probably not quite a fair comparison in terms of the NAFTA panelists and necessarily the CIT judges.
Just a thought on that. It's a very good observation. Just so you know, when the goods come from Canada or Mexico, there's an option about which route of appeal to take. They can take either route of appeal. And the federal court route of appeal was single judge at the U.S. Court of International Trade, and then an appeal from that to a 3-judge panel at the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. CIT, about half the cases they do are NEW countervailing, and about the other half are customs law cases. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit, most of what they do are actually intellectual property cases, but still a big chunk are the trade, again, half of which are customs and half of which are binational panels. And I just want to say one other thing, and I don't want to give you the misimpression. We do from time to time have panelists who are real true experts who just decide to do it, even though they're not really being paid by their rates. It's not that we never have the top people. We do from time to time, but very few of them, and what we need to have is the top people from all countries in all chairs in these panels.
Thanks. I just wanted to say, if the rate's supposed to be $800 to $1,200 an hour, I'm clearly doing something wrong. One of the things I would point out also is unlike the judges of the Court of International Trade, who each have 2 full-time law clerks to help them with research and so forth, that the support that is provided to NAFTA panelists, in addition to the relatively low pay, is also extremely limited. In my understanding is that each panelist is entitled to hire 1 panelist assistant at the rate of 20 Canadian dollars an hour, which at least, well, I guess the Canadian dollar has appreciated a bit in the last couple of months, but it was 75 cents for a long time. $15 an hour. I'm not sure you can hire a babysitter in Washington for $15 an hour. And so in order to have someone to do research, and especially in a case between the U.S. and Canada or Mexico, you've got issues of translation to worry about, and things get complicated very quickly. And so you not only have panelists at relatively low pay, but they're also working without support staff largely, and that also I think is part of the problem.
I can add, because some of the comments, well, I'm interested in the comment that we need more expertise on the panels. You guys will be amused to know that in the earliest years, the complaint was that there was much too much expertise on panels relative to the courts, which were notably highly deferential and not considered the cream of the bar. All of that has changed a great deal, but the complaint from the Commerce Department and the ITC was that they weren't getting as much. These guys know much too much, and they know our tricks, and so that was a little difference. The other question on the constitutionality. That was something that before we did this thing, the administration spent a lot of time on that issue. And as a matter of U.S. law, what is being enforced is panel. It is not considered that a panel decision is an appeals decision. It has no status. It can't be cited by except for the quality of its reasoning, I guess. But it isn't a precedent that binds on any other court, and the fact is there is no. I understand very well what David said. Hey, I'd like the same system that everybody else has for CVD and dumping law, but there isn't a constitutional right to a judicial review in of AD and CVD decisions. Anyway, Ken, how do you like to handle this on questions?
We'll have a pass mic if people can identify themselves, their affiliations, and we'd like to play by what we call the Scott Miller rules. So if you can ask your question in the form of a question, it would be much appreciated instead of giving some speeches. We'll have a mic runner who can bring around the microphones. You want to identify, Chip? You want to just call out?
In the back? You're the one.
You're gonna meet him halfway, but he can take you fast for him. Good morning. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I'm Louis Leibowitz. Have my own office now. I've been with large law firms and specializing in trade for many years. Chip Rowe took me down memory lane. So my question has to do with the reason we have Chapter 19. I was around then at that time as well, had to explain to clients why we have Chapter 19, and certainly like any work of humanity, it's not perfect. The real problem, it seemed to me at the time, it still seems to me, is not judicial review, it's the agency. Getting a Chapter 19 that would actually replace the Commerce Department, for example, or the ITC, with a binational panel of people who could do the cases and impose their discretion on these cases was clearly impossible. It's impractical and politically impossible. This was a second best idea. If you're going to replace a second best idea, you need to have an idea that's a little bit better. And I think, again, the elephant in the room, or perhaps the brontosaurus in the room, is the agency itself and the way it makes decisions and the way it calls the shot. To me, and I just want to ask for your views if you have them, a margin of 220% should be presumptively irrational. It shouldn't be entitled to any deference because it's too high. When Chip imposed sanctions at USTR, 100% duty was considered plenty to stop trade. So I wonder how you feel about a rule like that. Thank you.
I'll jump in there and take on that 220% right now. It's not punitive. Neither anti-dumping duties nor countervailing duties are punitive in any way. They're intended to offset unfair trade practices. With dumping, the unfair trade practices dumping, you determine the dumping margin, which is the magnitude of the dumping and the magnitude of the duty, is set to offset the impact of the dumping, no more, no less. It's not perfect, the analysis, but that's the intention. With countervailing duties, and this is a countervailing duty we're talking about, the goods, the U.S. government has found the goods have been subsidized. They found the subsidies fall into a particular category of subsidies, which we call countervailable subsidies, and that the subsidized goods are causing or threatening to cause material injury to the U.S. industry. And the bottom line is that the amount of the countervailing duty is a pure matter of number crunching, depending on the amount of the subsidy. Now, number crunching is never quite as objective as you think it is, and famously you have these preliminary decisions with these deposit rates, and then they come out with a final decision at a totally different rate, which will become the final rate, which proves that the number crunching is not quite as objective and scientific as you think. But the bottom line is that the amount of the rate is a result of the amount of the subsidy. The data they received from the governments of Canada, the government of Quebec, the government of the UK, because there was some manufacturing of parts in the UK, and there were subsidies all along, and they did number crunching, and that's what determines the amount of the duty. It's always possible they'll ultimately find, or on review and appeal, someone will find the subsidy was not countervailable, then it's out the window. It's always possible the finding will be made that the U.S. industry is not threatened with material injury, then the whole thing's out the window. It's possible that they redo the number crunching and find out they made a mistake and the duty's lower. But that's what determines it. It's not punitive and it's not political.
Sorry, and if I could just add to that, I think, if in fact the problem is that the 220% duty rate that was found in Bombardier is in fact inconsistent with U.S. international obligations, the agency has done something that is just simply not provided for in the definition of subsidies that the United States and Canada and 100 plus other countries have agreed to in the WTO. There is binding dispute settlement to resolve that in the WTO. The question for a Chapter 19 panel is that determination consistent with U.S. law? And that, to me, I don't see how having internationally binding dispute settlement helps resolve the question of whether that U.S. government agency action is consistent with U.S. law. And we can look at I'm not participating in the Bombardier case. I don't know. Most of the subsidy, as I understand it, that Commerce found was the government of Quebec purchasing a significant purchasing a large equity stake in the company, and there are rules in the Subsidies and Countervailing Measures Agreement about when equity infusions are subsidies and how you measure them. And either Commerce followed the rules or they didn't. And there are rules in U.S. law about how you measure that type of subsidy. And either they followed U.S. law or they didn't. And having binding dispute settlement, international dispute settlement for the U.S. law question doesn't seem to me to move the ball forward in answering the question whether that's consistent with U.S. law or whether it's consistent with international obligations. We already have a U.S. court system to do the domestic issue. We have binding international dispute settlement to do the WTO issue. I'm not sure why adding yet another institution helps to resolve the question.
I don't want to belabor the point, but just for crystal clarity, there's two wholly different levels of law here. There's the international law, that's the WTO treaties and NAFTA, and how they govern what the United States government as a whole may and may not do, and if we break those rules, we've breached the treaty. Then inside the United States, you have a U.S. statute, which is one branch of our government, the Congress, instructing another branch of our government, the executive branch agencies, in this case the ITC and the Commerce Department, on how to actually go out and do what we're supposed to do. And the only thing that's on appeal before a NAFTA binational panel, as David has said correctly multiple times, is whether the U.S. agency has acted consistently with the U.S. statute. The question of whether the U.S. statute is consistent with our treaty obligations, WTO and NAFTA, that's for either, if it's a NAFTA question, a NAFTA Chapter 20 panel, or if it's WTO law, a WTO dispute resolution. And as David has mentioned, all the anti-dumping countervailing duty rules come from the WTO agreements on subsidies and countervailing measures, the WTO agreement on anti-dumping, and the GATT, three different articles of the GATT. But all of that law is also incorporated by reference into NAFTA, so a violation of these rules can be even considered a violation of both sets, and it can ultimately end up either in Chapter 20 or and WTO dispute resolution. But the bottom line is that if you're asking whether the U.S. statute is correct under the treaties, that's state-state dispute. But if you're asking whether the action of the agencies is correct under the U.S. statute, that goes either to the U.S. federal courts or a NAFTA Chapter 19 panel.
I'm Robin Turner. I'm with the U.S. International Trade Commission. I'm speaking for myself in terms of asking the question, but I have argued before the NAFTA, the federal courts, and also the WTO. So I guess my question here is and Matt just laid out the way that the laws and what Chapter 19, what law it uses, and the Chapter 19 is looking at U.S. law. So the question is why would you not think a judicial system, which actually is set up to look at the law, whether it's in the United States, Canada, or Mexico, why would that not be the appropriate place to bring not a country-to-country proceeding, but a proceeding between parties? And I guess this is really directed to Ms. Feldman.
Thanks very much for your question. Before I forget, I did want to make the point early on. We're talking, of course, about Canada and the United States, and largely in the use of Chapter 19 here in the United States. But don't forget, Americans have brought Chapter 19 cases against Canada, and Americans have brought Chapter 19 cases against Mexico. And my understanding is, while there haven't been that many in recent years against Canada, there's still been quite a few where the United States has thought it was in their interest to bring a Chapter 19 case against Mexico. So it's not only Canada-US, and it doesn't only go one way. So I think that's an important point. I think it's important to go back to the point that Chip made. I think in the early days, there certainly was a perception that there was undue deference shown by U.S. courts to its administrative agencies. And that when you had a NAFTA panel, you had 5 people with more time and better prepared to look at all the issues and to look at what the investigating authorities were actually doing. And I've heard my colleagues here talk about the fact that these investigations are not political, that you look at the statute and you apply it. And I have to tell you that the perception of many of the United States trading partners is rather different. That there certainly is a view that investigating authorities may come up with results that meet particular objectives, and that's another reason to have an impartial review, which is the genesis of Chapter 19. If I could just make another point, when I was looking back at some material in preparation for this panel, in 1985, so in the lead up to the Canada-US FTA negotiations, 80% of the worldwide CVD duties in place were US duties. So I think we all know that the US has been a great user of AD and CVD, and as I said, a perception that perhaps the use of these remedies has not always has been used to block what is really fair competition.
Oh, I have several responses. I'll make them super quick. First, the last comment. No question the United States has utilized anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties more than any other country in the world. The funny thing happened, we started doing that many years ago, and the rest of the world got worried, which is why in the Tokyo round, we were kind of forced into much more precise rules about when we could and when we couldn't impose these duties. The world thought that was going to rein us in, but what that really did is it spawned an entire cottage industry in the United States of lawyers and economists and government officials who did nothing but specialize in these new very, very complex rules, and we continue to impose anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties. It just got more expensive for everyone involved to pay the costs, and other countries got pushed out because they didn't have whole cottage industries. They didn't have a bar, they didn't have a bench, they didn't have judges and lawyers and other experts who had enough expertise even to do this correctly, which is why other countries found it harder and harder to do it. It had really a counterintuitive effect. But we do take advantage of this. Other countries can legally, but practically it's harder. As far as the courts and deference, two things you need to keep in mind. Very important. There's actually a certain amount of deference that the appeals tribunal, whether it's a federal court or a binational panel, is supposed to give to the U.S. agency. Written into our law, our whole system of appealing anytime any decision by any U.S. agency is appealed to a U.S. federal court or other tribunal, that tribunal is supposed to give a certain amount of deference. It's written into the law. So the question is not, are they giving deference? The question is, of course, are they giving more deference than the deference they're supposed to give? My answer to that question is that the United States federal courts are the most professional and impartial adjudicators in the history of the world. And they are unparalleled in history and unparalleled on this earth today. And I think Canada and Mexico made a big mistake by assuming otherwise. One of the most interesting things that came out of Chapter 19 when we saw the experience of it as compared to the expectations is that binational panels actually, for a long time, statistically, were less likely to issue decisions that overturned U.S. agency orders than the federal courts were. Now, I don't know if that's still the case. Someone counted after several years and realized that the binational panels were overturning U.S. anti-dumping duty orders and countervailing duty orders less often than U.S. federal courts. But it doesn't surprise me. I don't think the federal courts ever gave more deference than they were supposed to. And I don't think having the binational panels ever increased the likelihood of having those orders overturned. So I don't even think it had the effect that Canada and Mexico wanted to have.
I always favor the white-haired guys. I can't tell you why.
Hi, I'm Ian Ferguson with the Congressional Research Service. I have a question about Chapter 20. As it was mentioned, there are parts, if NAFTA is successfully renegotiated, there will be parts of it that aren't in the that do not have any kind of companion in the WTO, and so the WTO presumably wouldn't be able to look at those or review those cases. Do you all have any suggestions or recommendations about how Chapter 20 could be improved, given that basically it's not used now, and there's probably a reason for it not being used now?
It hasn't been used, and I'm constrained from my ability to talk about what's going on the inside with respect to that issue. But there are some problems with the functioning of Chapter 20 that need to be fixed in this NAFTA renegotiation. It's a very high priority for the United States. It's something that we must get for Chapter 20 to work properly. Hopefully we'll get those fixes, and hopefully Chapter 20 will then work properly. That's the state-state dispute mechanism, and it needs to work.
Let me just say on that, I think from a Canadian perspective, we want Chapter 20 to work. And so I think we need to look at some mechanisms such as panelists, choice of panelist, and one party to the dispute not being able to block indefinitely potential panelists. So I think there are a lot of issues around process that can be fixed and make it more efficient going forward. I think the three parties probably share a view that it should be open and transparent. And I'm sure that those are some of the issues that will be talked about as we move forward with Chapter 20. Canada and the US have traditionally shared the position that submissions should be public and hearings could be open. And so I think these are all things that can be looked at. But I think there are process improvements. And then, of course, the need for a binding Chapter 20 process. I think that's really important, as you mentioned, because there will be obligations that go beyond what are in the WTO.
I can actually add a little bit on that. It's too bad that Mexico isn't here, because Mexico, I think, probably thinks that the Chapter 20 improvements are in particular, the United States was able to block up some cases that it wasn't intended, but the U.S. was able to, in effect, prevent the functioning of Chapter 20 as intended. In the case that was brought by the Mexicans. One of the big problems was that there was supposed to be a roster of esteemed panelists that were already and agreed among the parties by the time of entry into force, and that got politicized for kind of a crazy reason. Actually, the U.S. administration got into a kind of a diversity thing. It was no longer about how many experts we had, but how representative they were of or did they look enough like America or something like that. And by then the first dispute happened, and once there's a dispute in motion, governments just lose their minds, because you just want to win that case no matter what. So.
Hello, Brett Fordham with Inside U.S. Trade. I'm just looking at the options of what the negotiators could do with Chapter 19. I mean, obviously, they can leave it, they can get rid of it, which one of those seems very unlikely. But in terms of potential tweaks or changes, given the priority Ambassador Light has put to getting rid of it, I'm somewhat skeptical that he's going to decide to just invest more in terms of remuneration. So what options are left? How can the negotiators move forward here and try and find some way to find a common ground, and how politically likely do you find those options to be?
Well, another idea that I had is that if the softwood lumber agreement failed, an option would be to carve lumber out of Chapter 19, leave it in place, just it doesn't apply to lumber. That was before the aircraft case. So not sure that that's a workable solution anymore. David, do you have some more thoughts on that?
Sorry, thanks. To be honest, I mean, as I look at it, I'm approaching this from the perspective of that it seems to be that Chapter 19 we have it. It's a legacy of a different time. And it is something that really doesn't serve a function today in terms of providing something that isn't available elsewhere. And so I'm not sure that any tweaks really solve the fundamental problems, at least from my perspective. I'm not sure that can be done. I do recognize that that from the U.S. government's perspective, this is a large negotiation. There are a lot of different issues here, and the United States is not going to get everything that it's looking for, and neither is anybody else. But just sort of looking at this issue objectively, it seems to me that I'm not sure what benefit it is providing, and it's causing a bunch of problems. It really shouldn't be there, and how the negotiators move forward to do that is something that I think they need to work out. I'm not sure that I, from my perspective, I would have. You know, I suppose there are some tweaks you can make to make it marginally better, but I think that I think the fundamental flaw is with the concept of having international dispute settlement to resolve a domestic law issue, and I'm not sure that there's a way to make it work.